If you're Greek and a proud Greek, you may be wondering, as a Greek, how come every other language calls you Greek, but you, as a Greek in Greek, don't call yourselves Greek? You call yourselves Hellenics. Is it everyone else that's crazy? Or is it you, Philibou, who's wrong? Let's find out together. I'm Luke, and this is Polymathy. Let's start with the Greek word for Greek, at least in ancient Greek, and that's Hellen. In ancient Greek pronunciation, the modern Greeks like to pronounce this Hellin.
Héllēnes wasn't the original term for Greeks in Greek, however. Homer called the Greeks Ἀχαιοί, Ἀχαιοί in modern Greek pronunciation, the Achaeans who bravely fought at Troy. Homer also used the terms Argeioi, Argives, and Danaoi, Danaans, to signify the Greeks as a whole. Argii and Danaoi in modern Greek pronunciation. Back in Homer's day, the 8th century BC, the Hellenics were just a small Greek tribe in southern Thessaly, in or near the city of Phthia, Ptia in classical Attic, Phthia in modern Greek pronunciation, Ptie in Ionic or Homeric Greek, the birthplace of Achilles, and it was in or next to the region of Thessaly called Hellas by Homer. Nunautus hossoi to belasgi konargos enaion, oidalon oidalopen, oide trekina nemunto, oide kon ptien, ed helladaka ligunaika, murmidones de kaleunto kai Hellēnes kai Achaîoi. Now further, all those who inhabited Pelasgian Argos and dwelt in Alos and Alope and Trachis, and who held Phthia and Hellas, the land of fair women, and were called Myrmidons, and Hellenes and Achaeans. Hellas is the normal word for Greece in classical Greek, so this demonstrates how Hellas and Hellēnes did not yet signify Greece and Greeks collectively in Homer's day. So how did this word Hellēnes come to be the universal name for Greeks in Greek by classical times? Now here we have a mix of legend and fact and pure myth. After the Trojan War, some early cities allied together into the great Amphictyonic League to protect the Temple of Apollo in Delphi and the Temple of Demeter at Anthela, and its foundational myth held that the creator of the league was Amphictyon, brother of Hellen, Hellen, with two L's, not to be confused with Helen of Troy, Hellene, in ancient Greek, unrelated to Hellen. Hellen and Amphictyon were both the sons of Deucalion. Deucalion is comparable to the biblical Noah, if you like, as he survives the primordial flood. In any case, all we know about Amphictyon and his brother Hellen is what has been handed down to us in myth. But the Amphictyonic League survived into the real history of the classical period as an important political and religious organization. Since the members of the League were a mix of more than one Greek tribe, such as the Ionians and the Dorians, they may have taken on the name Hellēnes to unify themselves culturally as the tribes spread apart. Assuming that Hellen and Amphictyon were pure inventions of the founding myth, the character of Hellen seems to have been created to justify the reason why the Pan-Hellenic name had become Hellēnes. In the mythology, Hellen was the father of Doris, Aeolus, and Xuthus. Xuthus was the father of Achaeus and Ion. These mythical patriarchs give us the historical Ionian, Dorian, Aeolian, and Achaean tribes. We may compare this to Noah, who fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The name Japheth is related to the Greek Iapetus, a titan in Greek mythology. Japheth's sons included Javan, Rhodanim, and Kittim, which are connected with Ionia, Rhodes, and Cyprus.
So given that, how come pretty much every other language uses the word Greek for Greek instead of the Greek word for Greek, which is Hellēnes or Hellēnes? Well, for that, we have to talk about the ancient Romans, and there's no place better than an ancient Roman aqueduct like this one. Now, to really understand and to appreciate these ancient etymologies, we should learn Latin and ancient Greek, and the best way to do that is with this video sponsor, the Ancient Language Institute.
ALI is where you can master the classical languages, thanks to the unique audio and video resources available to students and the outstanding instruction you will receive from teachers who will be speaking to you in Greek and you to them every class. Whether you're interested in Homeric epics, classical philosophy, or biblical koine, ALI's courses will take you from absolute beginner to being able to read the Greek New Testament, Aesop's Fables, pre-Socratic philosophers, the Romance of Alexander, the Ephesian Tale, and even Plato's Euthyphro after just 1 year of instruction. And not just Greek, but Latin, Old English, and Classical Hebrew are yours for the taking in courses that train you to become a fluent reader of your favorite ancient language.
Beginner level cohorts start this spring in Latin, Ancient Greek, Anglo-Saxon, and Biblical Hebrew. Registration for the spring term closes December 16th.
There's no better way to start out on a new language, modern or ancient. ALI excels in comprehensible input approaches that make even difficult concepts fun and easy to acquire.
And if you're not a beginner, there's a wide variety of advanced classes in Latin, Ancient Greek, Hebrew, and Old English.
So go to ancientlanguage.com today to take a journey into the distant past and learn why those of us who have learned these ancient languages find them so enriching.
When Roman civilization was in its infancy, Greeks had already colonized a large part of southern Italy, which is still called Magna Grecia today. The Greeks there evidently called themselves Graioui or Graikoí.
Graei and greci, respectively in modern Greek pronunciation. And these terms come into Latin as Graei, the more poetic version, and Graiki, the common term, hence Graecia, or Grecia in ecclesiastical pronunciation, which means Greece.
And why did these Greek colonists call themselves Graikoí?
Well, according to late 19th and early 20th century German historian Georg Buzold, the colonists who founded Cumae in classical Latin pronunciation, in the 8th century BC, which was the first colony in mainland Italy, they were a mix of Euboeans and Boeotians. Those are two neighboring regions in Greece, north of Athens, and they're divided by the Gulf of Euboea. And the majority of these colonists probably came from the cities of Chalcis, Chalkis, and Eretria, on the east side of the Gulf, and from Graea on the west side, on the Boeotian side. Evidently, the Cumae colonists referred to themselves as Graikoí when dealing with the early Romans, and the Romans came to name all the Greek colonists in southern Italy Graeci, a term later associated in Latin with all Greeks. Graea in modern Greek pronunciation, called Graea in Latin and Graea in English, well, it's actually a bit of a mystery exactly where this place is, and it was even to the ancients. It first appears in the second book of the Iliad, where Homer lists the Greek armies that sailed to Troy. And among the Boeotians, Graea is named. Tispean Graean Tekaeorykorom Mykaleson. But where in Boeotia precisely was Graea? Aristotle in the 4th century BC associated Graea with the town Oropus, and Pausanias, the geographer in the 2nd century BC, says that it was in fact the city of Tanagra.
Darmak Angelad at Tanagra.
Pausanias shows that Tanagra and Tanagraia are interchangeable, and that this eventually became Graea before changing back to Tanagra. Here's an excerpt from his description of Greece, recited in Romaic Lucian pronunciation, which is appropriate to the century in which Pausanias lived. Tanagraioi deoi kistens pisi poimandron genestai legusi. The people of Tanagra say that their founder was Pimander. Poimandron de gunai kapasin agagestai Tanagran, tugaterai yoru. It is said that Pimander married Tanagra, a daughter of Hellēnes. Tautes dubiu proeltuses epimakrotaton, tus perioicus pasin apelontas donoma, ten de gunai gauten galin graean, Gaiana Chronon ten Polin. There is a story that, as she reached extreme old age, her neighbors ceased to call her by this name and gave the name of Graea, old woman, first to the woman herself, and in course of time to the city. Diaminaito nomaesto sulton hos kai homeron en catalogo, tespian graean tegaeorykoron mykaleson. The name, they say, persisted so long that even Homer says it in the catalog. Thespia, Graea, and wide Mycalesis. Chrono de eusteron to nomat Archaîon anesosanto. Later, however, it recovered its old name. As for the ultimate etymology of Graea, the city, Indo-European linguist Robert Beeks confirms Pausanias' folk etymology, because Graea indeed means old woman, a variation of Graeis and Graus, which also mean old woman, words related to geron, old man. Graea could have meant grey and venerable. Curiously, the similarity to the English grey is coincidental, which has a different Proto-Indo-European root. The tana part of this word could be related to the adjective tanaos, which means tall, outstretched, long, and tanaon geras itself means old age. Thus, Tanagraia sounds like just that, extreme old age, which seems to fit Pausanias' commentary, but that's just my conjecture. So that would seem to settle it, right? Greeks are called Graikoí in Latin, and thus Greek in English, and similar terms in other languages, because the Graikoí colonists that the Romans met in Italy came from Graea in Boeotia. Well, let's look at the etymology of Hellen. The name Hellen is probably from the Hellēi or Selloi. Initial S becomes H regularly as Greek passes from the archaic to classical stage. The Selloi were a tribe that lived in Epirus, according to Aristotle. O kalumenos epideo kalionos kataklysmos, kekarutos periton Hellenikon egeneto malistatopon, kai tutu periten Hellada ten Archaian, haute destine peridodonen, kai ton Achaîoion, udosgar polakut reoma metaplebleken. The deluge in the time of Deucalion, for instance, took place chiefly in the Greek world, and ended especially in the region of ancient Hellas, which is in the area around Dodona and the Achaîoi, a river which has often changed its course. Oi kungar hoi selloi entauta, kai hoi kalumenoi totemen Graikoí, nunt Hellēnes. Here the Selli or Selloi dwelt, and those who were formerly called Graikoí, Graikoí, are now called Hellenes, Hellēnes. Aristotle is saying that what for him was ancient Hellas, the name for Greece in Greek, well, that used to be just part of Epirus, perhaps the way the Greeks were migrating into the southern part of the peninsula, and that the inhabitants were known as Selloi and Graikoí. Aristotle adds that the Graikoí later became known as Hellēnes. Now, based on Aristotle's commentary, Indo-European linguist Robert Beek supposes that Selloi changed to Sellanes, then to Hellenes, and then finally to Hellēnes for the Attic Ionic, where long alpha becomes eta in certain situations. But the really weird thing here is that Aristotle is saying that the Greeks who called themselves Hellēnes in his day used to call themselves Graikoí back in the times of the primordial flood of Deucalion. The 7th century BC lyric poet Alcman said the same thing, and named Graeca the mother of Hellen, as the Graikoí later were called Hellēnes. Add to that the Parian Marble, a chronicle written on a stele in the 3rd century BC found on the island of Paros, which covers legends and deeds of the millennium prior to its inscription, which states on line 6, Apu Hellen hodeo kalionos ptiodidos e basileuse, kai Hellēnes onomastesan, toprotoron Graikoí kalumenoi. From the time Hellen, son of Deucalion, became king of Thyotis, hence they were named Hellenes, Hellēnes, being formerly called the Greeks, Graikoí. That makes 3 references in 3 different centuries in antiquity to the same thing. Aristotle, Alcman, and the Parian Chronicle state that the Hellēnes used to be called Graikoí. If these are true accounts of the changing Greek ethnonym, that would mean that Georg Busolt was wrong. The reason the settlers at Cumae were called Graikoí was not because they came from Graea, the other name for Tanagra.
Shaka, when the walls fell.
Now, I don't think there's any reason to doubt that the Greek colonists in southern Italy that the Romans first met called themselves Graikoí. So then, given the repetition of this idea in antiquity that the Hellēnes used to be called Graikoí, I'm inclined to believe that the 8th century BC Greek colonists in Italy were known as Graikoí because that was simply the current term for Greeks in that century, at least among those colonists, and that the old ethnonym was gradually replaced as the Amphictyonic League, which may have popularized the term Hellēnes, continued to flourish. But if that really were the case, that Graikoí was the dominant ethnonym for Greeks in more archaic times, then why is Graikoí not the term Homer uses for Greeks? Indeed, as mentioned before, Homer gives the terms Achaeans, Argives, and Danaans for the Greeks collectively, which in themselves are also tribal names. Argives and Danaans referring to those who came from Argos, Danaus was its mythical founder, and Achaeans refers to Achaea, both places on the Peloponnese. It's possible Homer was using terms that he thought were archaic and therefore appropriate for the long-ago Trojan War he was recounting. After all, the Homeric epics are understood to be oral transmission of poems which were first composed some centuries before Homer was alive. If Homer existed, though, he would, in this scenario, merely have been the final rhapsode to sing them before they were written down, in which case the old terms Achaîoi, Argeioi, and Danaoi were baked into the meter and certainly not to be replaced by Graikoí, much less Hellēnes. The other possibility, is that Graikoí was not a universal term for Greeks in the 8th century and 7th centuries BC, and was only used by some either as a local name of a particular tribe or as a regional name used collectively by several tribes, namely those who colonized southern Italy, and that's how the Romans came to call them Graikoí. In any case, it's thanks to the Romans that most languages in Europe and around the world call Greeks Greek, or some variant of that term. But if you study Coptic, as I do, you will have come across the word weinin for Greek, such as in this passage from John 19:20 of the Bohairic Coptic Bible. Wo nafiskeut be emet Hebreus, emet Romeos, emet weinin. And it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, in Greek. Weinin? What the heck is that from? Weinin in Coptic comes from an earlier stage of ancient Egyptian called Demotic, and the Demotic word was borrowed from Imperial Aramaic, which had been taken from the ancient Greek term Iawon, an archaic term for Ionian. Due to the dominant presence of the Ionians in the Aegean Sea and their trade with other cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean, names based on Ionian for Greek came into Biblical Hebrew, Old Persian, and Sanskrit, and are still current in Hindi, Arabic, Turkish, Armenian, Azerbaijani, Kurdish, and others. Thus, we have a situation where certain exonyms have come to mean Greek collectively, but were originally taken from the names of certain tribes that happened to come in contact with the cultures that spread those names to represent the whole by metonymy. Now, before you, Filemu, become paranoid that the Westerners and the Easterners are out to put you down by using these exonyms, can we think of some other people this has happened to? Ah, yes, the Germans, who call themselves Deutsch. Thanks to the Romans, we call it Germany in English and other languages.
Yes, xerokala Filemu. You tried to name everything in the cosmos after Greek terms, but you didn't get everything, and the Romans ended up successfully naming the rest. You just have to live with that.
In German, the Deutsch live in Deutschland. In Spanish, the Alemanes live in Alemania. In Finnish, the Saksalaiset live in Saksa. And in Latin, the Germani live in Germania. All names derived from different Germanic tribes that came into contact with their neighbors, very similar to the exonyms for the Greeks. And it's not just the Germans and the Greeks that have to deal with exonyms. In English, we call the inhabitants of the Netherlands Dutch. In Polish, they call Italy Włochy, and Italians Włosi. India is Bharat in Hindi, China is Zhongguo in Chinese, Japan is Nihon in Japanese, and Korea is Hangul in Korean.
And you do this too, Filemu, calling the French Galli, from the ancient Greek Galloi, Gauls, Galli in Latin. The French haven't called themselves Gauls for 1,500 years since the end of the Western Roman Empire, but you're still calling them that? Do you really have the right to call the French something other than what they call themselves? Well, you might say, nah, because, well, the French are
cheese-eating surrender monkeys!
But the real reason is that it's perfectly acceptable to have an exonym in another language of a different country. It happens all the time. Gallia is the name of that country in your language.
And you're just using the older name for inhabitants of that territory. If Graikoí was still the common name for Greeks in the time of first contact with the Romans, this is directly comparable to Greeks continuing to call les Français Ralli. After all, it would be completely unreasonable for you to try to change the name of your country in English.
Wait, Turkey changed its name to Turkey? Wait, maybe it's supposed to be like Turkey, yay! Or Turkey, yeah! It's some interesting marketing. So don't be angry at the Romans, Filemu. It's not their fault. It's Alexander the Great's fault for going east when he should have gone west. Thanks so much again to the Ancient Language Institute, and thanks to each and every one of my Patreon supporters. Yes. Let's start with the ancient work. So given that, how come the word for Greek in so many Weinin, what the heck is that from? So given that, how come the word for Greek, we're not moving on. So don't be angry at the Romans, Filemu. It's not their fault that everything else is. So given that, how come the word for Greek in so many other languages isn't Hellen or Hellenic or something? Damn it. Weinin, what the heck is that from? Okay, So don't be angry with the Romans, filez-mou. It's not their fault. It's Alexander the Great's fault, when he could have gone west as easily as he could have gone east. And this would have been another Alexandria instead of